As per my late client's wishes, the entirety of the estate.
It was a cold, silent night. The lights in the mansion dimmed except for the soft light coming from the living room. The protagonist, a young man in his early 20s, sat in one of the most luxurious armchairs in the house. He stared out the window, his mind full of doubts and fears, his heart pounding. After so many years hiding the truth, clinging to a facade that didn't represent him, the moment to reveal his true identity had arrived. The pressure he felt was almost unbearable. Throughout his life, he had always been the perfect son, the ideal successor. His father, one of the richest men in the country, always dreamed of having. All his father wanted was an heir who would carry on the family tradition, maintaining the financial empire he had built with so much sweat and dedication. The protagonist grew up with this in mind, knowing that his father wanted him to marry someone who shared his ambitions and interests, someone who would follow him as an extension of his own image. But there was something he had always hidden, something he could no longer hide. The young man had always known that his true essence did not match his father's expectations. And although he knew how much his father's love meant to him, he also knew that his father would never accept anything that challenged his traditionalist and rigid worldview. He took a deep breath and looked at the phone in his hands. Before making any decisions, he had spent the last few months talking to friends and even therapists, trying to understand his feelings and mentally preparing himself for what was to come. Finally, he had come to the conclusion that he could no longer live a lie. He needed to be who he truly was, even if it meant risking losing everything he had. It took him a few seconds to type the message on his phone. Dad, we need to talk. There's something really important I need to tell you. Can you give me some time tonight? Before sending the message, he questioned himself. Will he accept me? Will he understand me? The weight of these questions grew with each passing second. But he knew he could no longer hide, could no longer continue to live under the pressure of being someone he was not. With his heart beating faster than ever, he pressed send. The weight was excruciating. He knew that, depending on his father's response, his life would never be the same. 20 minutes passed before the phone vibrated. His father's message was short, but to the point. Okay, come to my office. He stood up immediately, his legs trembling. He tried to control himself, breathing deeply, but his mind was on the verge of collapse. He knew what was at stake. His future, his relationship with his father, his identity, all of it was about to be put to the test. He walked to his father's office, each step seeming heavier than the last. When he entered the room, he saw his father sitting in his chair, his gaze fixed on the dark wooden desk in front of him, as if waiting for something. His father, with his gray hair and firm posture, had always been an imposing figure. His presence exuded power, and the young man felt small before him, as if he were just a child again. You called me? Said the father, without looking up from the table. Yes, father, the young man replied, trying to remain calm. I need to tell you something very important about myself. His father finally looked at him, his expression serious and emotionless. What is it? Son, go ahead. He hesitated, his throat tight. His voice cracked for a moment, but he took a deep breath and finally said, Dad, I'm gay. Silence filled the room. His father didn't react at first. There was no immediate shock, but the young man felt the weight of the speechlessness. His father looked at him with an expression that mixed confusion and disappointment, and the silence was almost deafening. You... what? The father repeated, his voice lower now, but filled with disbelief. You're telling me that this whole life we've built, everything I've done for you, and now you tell me this. The protagonist couldn't find the words. He braced himself for anything, but the emotional impact was stronger than he imagined. The father continued, I expected so much from you. I always imagined you would follow in my footsteps, carry on our family name, and now you tell me you'd rather live a life I can't accept. That doesn't make sense. The young man felt the pain in his father's words, like a knife cutting into his soul. He knew the conversation wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to be so devastating. His father's frustration and anger were evident, but the son couldn't back down. He was there to be true to himself, even if it meant losing his father's love. Father, I love you, but I can't live a lie. I can't keep being someone I'm not, just to please you. The tension in the room grew even thicker. The father rose from his chair and began pacing the office, seemingly trying to process his son's words. The young man's anguish was palpable, and he felt as if his truth was ruining everything he had built with his father over the years. I can't accept this. Not now. Do you know what this means to our family, to our legacy? I don't know what to do with this, the father said, his voice shaking with frustration. The protagonist knew that no matter what was said, nothing would ever be the same again. He had revealed his truth, and now he would have to deal with the consequences. But deep down, he knew that by being honest with himself, he had taken the first step toward living the life he always wanted. Did you like this video? Like it and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that will touch your heart. And tell us, how do you think this story will end? Comment below. We want to hear your opinion. The silence that hung in the air inside the office was so thick, the protagonist could have touched it with his hands. He stood there, before his father, finally having the courage to reveal the truth he had kept hidden for so long. But as tension filled the room, the young man wondered if he was truly prepared to face the reaction of his father. A man of rigid character and deeply held beliefs who'd never hesitated to make quick, often ruthless decisions. Her father, seated behind a dark mahogany desk, looked imposing. The soft light streaming in through the window illuminated his serious face and his hands resting firmly on the wood. The tension in the air was almost palpable, as if the space itself were too cramped to bear the weight of what was about to unfold. The protagonist felt sweat dripping down his forehead, but he stood his ground. He had mentally prepared for this moment, for days, weeks, even months. However, nothing could prepare him for his father's reaction. "Dad," he began, his voice strained and a little shaky. I need to be honest with you. I'm homosexual." The word so sincere came out almost as a whisper. The young man felt the weight of them as they passed through his throat, as if revealing a part of himself that had been caged for years. He looked at his father, expecting some reaction, anything, but was met only with disconcerting silence. The father, looking directly into his son's eyes, didn't move. His gaze was fixed, as if trying to process the enormity of the words that had just been spoken. There were no shouts, no curses, but the lack of an immediate response was even more painful than any other reaction. The young man stood there, waiting, but nothing happened. Time seemed to stand still, and the weight of the room became unbearable. The father didn't say a word. The protagonist's breathing quickened even more as his father continued to watch him. He tried to understand what was going on in his mind. He knew his father wasn't an easy person to impress, but the lack of reaction left him completely disconcerted. The silence was broken by a sudden movement from his father. He stood up slowly, still without saying a word, and began pacing the office, his heavy steps as if each one were a reminder of the weight of the situation. The young man, still standing, stood there, waiting, feeling a growing sense that something terrible was about to happen. After a few moments, the father stopped. He looked at his son again, and his eyes were now filled with something the young man couldn't understand. It was a mixture of frustration, confusion, and a silent, building anger. The man took a deep breath and finally spoke, but his voice was harsh and cutting. You're not my son anymore." The words hit the young man like a punch to the gut. It was as if the earth had dropped out from under him. He could barely process what he had just heard. His father wasn't just rejecting him as a son. He was putting an end to everything they had experienced together. Those words, "you're not my son anymore," were like a deep cut and, at the same time, a definitive departure from everything he had known as fatherly love. The anger his father felt was evident in every syllable, every word he uttered. His father continued to pace the room, his voice now harsher and more indignant. "Everything I've done for you, everything we've built together, and now you tell me this. How could you do this to me? How could you disappoint me like this?" The young man felt the pressure on him increasing with each passing second, but at the same time, a deep sadness invaded his chest. He wanted to scream, to explain, to say that nothing had changed in his heart, that he was still the same person. But the pain of his father's words paralyzed him. There was no more room for explanations. "I've spent my entire life trying to make sure you had everything you wanted, that you were successful," the father continued, his voice louder now, a mix of frustration and disappointment. "I raised you to be my successor, to carry on our name, and you come here and tell me this. Now, who's going to take care of everything we've built? How am I going to look at the world knowing my own son is no longer who I thought he was?" The young man felt the heat of his father's anger, and the distance between them grew with each word. He knew his father wouldn't understand, and it tore him apart. But he also knew there was no turning back. He needed to live his truth, regardless of who accepted or rejected him. The room felt too small now, the space too cramped to hold so much tension. His father stepped closer, anger evident on his face. "Do you realize what you're doing? What have you done to our family, to our heritage? You destroyed everything we've built. I can't look at you the same way anymore." The protagonist, his chest tight with pain and confusion, tried to find an answer, something to restore the connection he'd always had with his father. But the words wouldn't come. He felt that somehow the person he loved most in the world had lost him forever. "I still love you," he said finally, his voice trembling, "but I can't hide who I am anymore." His father looked at him, his gaze filled with disbelief, as if trying to determine if there was any trace of a lie in what his son was saying. But there wasn't. The young man knew what he was saying was the absolute truth. And in that moment, even with his heart heavy and broken, he knew he had taken a crucial step toward his own freedom. The father took a deep breath, his eyes still filled with anger. But above all, a silent pain, something his son could never understand. The man turned to the window, looking at the vast empire he had built, which now seemed small before the weight of his emotional loss. He didn't want to accept it, but something inside him knew his relationship with his son had changed forever. "You are no longer my son," the father said, now with a cold, implacable calm, "and you will never again have what I have achieved." The young man stood there, heartbroken, knowing there was no turning back. But at the same time, feeling for the first time a strange sense of freedom. He had chosen his truth, regardless of the cost. And though the pain was immense, he knew he had taken the first step toward finding peace with his own identity. The weight of the truth weighed heavily on the young man's shoulders, and the silence following the revelation stretched for minutes, as if time had stopped. He knew this was the decisive moment, the one in which his life would take a new direction. He was prepared to face his father's rejection, but he never imagined the pain would be so immeasurable. His father, always a figure of authority, someone who had shaped and groomed him to be the successor to his fortune and legacy, now stood before him with the most somber expression he had ever seen. "You're not my son anymore." His father's words echoed through the room like thunder, and he felt his world slowly crumble. The weight of those words was like a punch to the chest, and for a moment, the young man couldn't find the words to respond. Everything he thought he knew about his relationship with his father vanished in a split second. The feeling of rejection was overwhelming, but something even more painful hit him. He wasn't being rejected just as a son, but as part of his story his father had crafted with such care and effort. That empire, that name, that family legacy his father had created now seemed distant, as if he were no longer a part of it. He didn't know how to feel, whether to be outraged or more. His mind was in turmoil, and the pain of being cast out of his family was deep and sharp. But what hurt him most was the fact that his father now saw him as an outsider, someone who had strayed from the right path. "You have shamed me," his father continued, his voice cold and accusatory, devoid of empathy. "I raised you to be my successor. I gave you everything you could ever want, and now you come here and tell me this. You destroyed it all. The inheritance, the family, everything I built. You destroyed it with a single decision." His father's words struck the young man with brutal force, like a hammer striking iron. He had always known that his father's acceptance was conditional, that everything he had, wealth, status, society's respect, was tied to his ability to live up to his father's expectation. But hearing those words, hearing them spoken aloud, was as if a veil had been lifted, and he finally saw the harsh reality. He was nothing more than a cog in the family machine, and that cog now was out of place. "You think you can just turn your back on our history, on everything we've done together?" His father continued, every word laced with anger, every syllable like a sharp blade. "I expected more from you. I expected you to be stronger, more normal, but you made me ashamed. Now, you're no longer a part of that." The young man wanted to scream, to defend what he believed to be his truth, to tell his father that his sexuality didn't make him less worthy of love, less worthy of respect. But the reality was different. He was being stripped not only of his father's love, but of his identity within the family. The pain was unbearable, and his father's every word seemed to tear pieces of him apart. What he feared most was becoming reality, the separation, the rupture he knew could happen but never truly wanted to face. "You will leave our home. You will no longer be part of our history," the father ordered, his words like a final decree. "You will no longer participate in the family business. I don't want to see you near me anymore." Those words were like a direct blow to the young man's heart. He tried to process them, tried to understand what was happening, but everything seemed to crumble before his eyes. His father, the man he had always respected and feared, now treated him like a stranger. He was rejected not only as a son, but as an heir, as part of a legacy he could never claim. The silence that followed was even more painful than any words spoken. The young man looked at his father, searching for a trace of humanity, something that would tell him that deep down he still loved him, but there was none. His father's gaze was relentless, a cold wall that could not be broken. The young man felt as if his life had been split into two parts, before and after this revelation. "I never thought it would come to this," his father said, his voice now lower, but filled with bitterness. "I thought, deep down, you would do the right thing. But now I see I was wrong to trust you. You let me down, and that, my son, is something I can never forgive." The young man felt the weight of these words fall upon him, crushing him. He knew he couldn't change what he had done, that he couldn't go back. But at the same time, he knew that although he was losing his father's love, he was gaining his own freedom. A painful freedom, no doubt, but a freedom that would finally allow him to live his truth, without hiding, without having to be someone he wasn't. Heartbroken and soul empty, the young man turned to leave the room. He knew this would be the last time he would see his father the way he had always known him. There was no more room for reconciliation, no more words that could heal the open wound. His father had expelled him not only from his home, but from his life, his history, his legacy. When he reached the door, his father caught his eye, but not with words of love or regret. Instead, he simply said, "Remember that you did this. You chose this path. Don't forget that you walked away from me, from our family." Those words were etched in the young man's mind like an indelible mark. He knew that by leaving that house, he was leaving behind everything he had ever known. His family, his empire, his legacy. But he also knew that by leaving all that behind, he was finally beginning a new journey, a journey where he could be who he truly was. Without fear, without shame, without the burden of a history that was not his own. The silence that followed his last conversation with his father still weighed heavily on the protagonist's heart. Every word spoken, every cold gesture was etched in his mind like an indelible tattoo, a constant reminder of the rejection he had faced. The pain of being cast out by his family, of losing his own father's affection, was something he never imagined he would experience. However, what was about to happen would be an even more devastating surprise. He was alone, sitting in his living room, staring at his cell phone. His father had sent a brief message after the confrontation, asking him to come to the family law firm. The protagonist, now in a fragile emotional state, didn't know what to expect, but he knew this invitation wasn't for a friendly conversation. Perhaps it was the final step toward formalizing the definitive separation. The idea of no longer being part of that life, of being a stranger to the only family he knew, was taking a cruel and real form in his mind. When he arrived at the office, he was immediately ushered into an imposing room, a room that reeked of power and wealth. The family lawyer, a serious and discreet man, sat at his desk, his expression open to interpretation. He seemed comfortable there, as if accustomed to dealing with the kind of situations involving money and inheritances. And the protagonist felt a lump tighten in his throat. "Please sit down," the lawyer said, his tone formal but not cold. "Your father asked me to deliver this to you." The young man sat down, and the lawyer handed him a black folder, embossed with the family name in gold. He didn't need to open it to know what was happening. His heart already knew. Everything inside him was screaming the answer, but he couldn't allow himself to believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. With his hands trembling slightly, he opened the folder. It was the will. The document that, until that moment, had represented his inheritance, his legacy, the one that had guaranteed him his place at the top of the family hierarchy. He read it silently. First, the formal beginning, with the names of the lawyers and the legal provisions that didn't directly concern him. But as his eyes moved to the final sections, his blood ran cold. When he reached the part that mentioned the heirs, the words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I, father's name, exclude from the succession the name of son's name. The aforementioned heir is disinherited for reasons that I consider sufficient and with full knowledge of his personal choices." The words were there, written coldly and without mercy. His name, once linked to the fortune, to the empire his father had built, was no longer there. It was as if he had been erased from the family history, as if he had never existed. The young man read it again, trying to understand if it was truly true, but the words remained unchanged. He had lost everything. The shock was immediate and immense. The impact was so profound that he couldn't breathe properly. How was this possible? How was he, who had been raised to be the successor to all his family's greatness, now treated like a nobody, like an outsider? His father had taken his resentment to the point of not only rejecting his love, but completely excluding his son from everything he had always known to be his life. He now had no claim to the family's fortune, its influence, its image. Everything he believed he would inherit was now in the hands of other people, other parts of the family that, until that moment, he had considered distant and even irrelevant. You're telling me I've been he asked, his voice hoarse, disbelief washing over him. The lawyer, apparently accustomed to this kind of situation, showed no emotion as he answered, "Yes, sir. Your name was removed from the will, as per your father's wishes." The young man felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. What he had feared his entire life, what he had always known could happen but never truly wanted to accept, had become reality. He was out of his family, out of the empire, out of everything he had thought his life would be. What he had mentally constructed in his mind as a secure and determined future had been destroyed by a simple decision by his father. There was no going back. Tears began to well up, but he held them back. He didn't want to be vulnerable in front of this man. He already felt the pain of his father's rejection, but now, realizing he was being cut out of the entire story, it hurt him even more deeply. He had been stripped not only of his family, but of his identity. He was nothing to his father anymore, nothing to his legacy. He wondered what was left for him now. The lawyer, noticing the heavy silence that followed, continued with more details. "Furthermore, since your name has been removed from the will, you will have no access to the family assets or control over the business. The estate will be passed to the other heirs your father designated." The young man could barely hear the words being spoken. He felt his mind reeling, trying to process the pain, trying to understand the meaning of it all. How could he rebuild his life now, when everything he knew had been ripped away from him in the blink of an eye? He felt small, insignificant, as if he had been erased from the very existence of his own family. "What do I do now?" he murmured, not expecting an answer, but perhaps searching for some word of comfort, some explanation that made sense. The lawyer looked at him empathetically, but without really being able to offer anything that would ease the pain. "It's best if you find your own way now, sir. There's nothing more to be done here." With that, the young man rose from his chair, feeling defeated. He knew he needed to leave, to get away from that place where his life had fallen apart. But before he left, he took one last look at the will, now lying on the table. He realized that, although he had lost everything, he still had one thing no one could take from him: his dignity and his freedom to start over. Still, the pain of helplessness and the loss of identity that had been taken from him would never be easy to overcome. But now he knew that the future was in his hands, and only he could decide how to move forward. Did you like this story? Like it and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming and moving stories. Comment below. What do you think the protagonist will do next? How would you react if you were in his shoes? The grand mansion where the protagonist grew up, which once seemed like an extension of his own soul, now seemed like a maze with no exit. The walls, once imbued with happy memories and family celebrations, now reflected an emptiness he never imagined he would feel. Every step he took inside that place, every echo of his own footprints on the marble floor, made him feel even more the distance that now separated him from his own story. The loss of his legacy wasn't just about the money or fortune accumulated by his family over generations. It was about the loss of everything he had been taught to believe in. It was a symbolic death of an identity he was sure he would carry with pride, and now he found himself stripped of it, abandoned to his own fate. Everything he knew was crumbling before him, and it wasn't just a financial matter. He had been groomed to be the family's successor, to take over the business, to continue the work his father and grandparents had begun. From a young age, the idea that he would carry on the family name was ingrained in his mind. The gala dinners, the charity events, the business trips, a part of the role he was supposed to play in the future of the dynasty his father had built with an iron fist. But now, in the blink of an eye, all was lost. The empire his family possessed was more than material wealth. It was the status, the respect that came with it, the admiration of others, the feeling of being on top of the world. The family legacy represented a continuous line of success, power, and influence. It was the story of a lineage that began from nothing but, through effort and vision, became one of the most respected in society. What was now evident, however, was the loss of that continuity. It had been cut off, and with it, everything his ancestors had achieved seemed to crumble. The young protagonist sat in the center of the mansion's main room, observing the details of a space that had once been his home but now felt like a stranger. What was left of that place, that family, that history? He had been excluded from the will, expelled from the family life that shaped him, and with it, the sense of belonging he had always felt was shattered. The pain he felt was not only from losing access to material possessions, but from the feeling of no longer being part of a narrative he had always known was his. He wondered, what was the price of acceptance? He had been raised to follow a path, to fit into his father's expectations, to be who everyone expected him to be. Since childhood, the lessons about success and carrying on the family name with honor and glory were constantly present. But now, rejected, cut out of the succession, he began to question everything he had been taught. What was worth more, living his own truth, or conforming to the expectations he knew would never be enough for his father? The price of acceptance wasn't something he'd ever considered before. He'd always known that being accepted by his family meant following their rules, meeting their expectations, and carrying the weight of their legacy with pride. But what would happen if he were no longer accepted? And what would he lose by giving up that legacy to live as he truly was? The questions echoed in his mind, and he couldn't find clear answers. All his life, he had known that his identity was intrinsically linked to the family's success. He was the natural heir, the next in line to assume control of the empire. He had been groomed for this from a young age, with a rigorous education, mentoring, and guidance designed to prepare him for leadership. But when he was excluded from the succession, all that was gone. The sense of loss wasn't just financial. It was the loss of a future he imagined was rightfully his. The loss of a destiny that suddenly seemed to no longer matter. He reflected on the values he had internalized throughout his life. Family had always been more than anything. It was the foundation that sustained his life. But now, finding himself rejected, he began to question the true value of that family, those expectations. What would he lose by abandoning this path imposed on him? What would he gain by embracing his true identity, unfettered by family tradition? The pain of being disowned was profound, but there was a growing sense that by following his own path, he might discover a kind of freedom he had never experienced. He knew his father, his authority figure, wouldn't understand. He knew the rejection wouldn't be easy to bear. But he also knew that by trying to live a life that wasn't his own, he was losing himself. The pain of losing his family legacy was a pain he couldn't deny, but there was also a weight he carried every day for not being who he truly was. He was, in some ways, losing more than wealth and status. He was losing himself. As he gazed out the mansion's window at the stunning view of the city below, he wondered if he could ever rebuild his life without the weight of his family's legacy. The loss was devastating, but at the same time, a small spark of hope began to ignite within him. He remembered something he had always been taught. True legacy is not built solely on material possessions, but on the ability to live by one's own principles, by being true to oneself. Perhaps, by abandoning the fortune and status his family offered him, he was truly creating his own. The silence inside the house now seemed heavier than ever. The young man knew that by leaving the mansion, he was walking away from an important chapter in his life. He had lost his legacy, but perhaps this was the first step toward creating something new, something that was truly his. The loss of the billionaire family legacy wasn't just a matter of finances, but a matter of identity. He had lost what he thought was his future, but now he was beginning to realize that the true future was in his hands. He rose from his chair, took one last look at the house, and began walking toward the door. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to walk toward it, free from constraints, free from outside expectations. The pain of losing everything he knew and loved was overwhelming, but the pain of no longer being who he truly was had been unbearable. And in the end, he knew that by taking this step, he was finally beginning to live according to what he believed was right, regardless of what he had lost in the process. The room was utterly silent, a silence that seemed amplified by the darkness of the night. The only light illuminating the space came from the window where the full moon reflected in the glass, casting soft shadows on the walls. The protagonist lay in bed, his arms stretched out to his sides, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. His mind was distant, wandering to a place where memories tormented him. He could no longer escape the pain, unable to shake the thoughts that consumed him. That silence reflected his father's absence. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, now seemed like a field of ruins. His childhood memories, the ones he had always cherished, were being revisited raw and unfiltered, and he was forced to face a truth he had tried to ignore until then. He couldn't understand how he had gotten here, how the relationship with his father, which had once seemed solid and unbreakable, had crumbled so quickly. The cut in the will, the explicit rejection, the end of the legacy he believed he would have, it all boiled down to a single question. Where did it all go wrong? His mind wanders away from the darkness of his room and travels back in time. He sees himself younger in his childhood home. His father, with his firm gaze and authority, but also with gestures of affection that he can now recall clearly. He remembers the days when his father taught him to ride a bike, the afternoons they played soccer in the garden. He remembers the way his father looked at him with pride at family gatherings, the serious conversations about life, about what it meant to be a successful man. But as he revisits these memories, he also finds himself reflecting on his father's rigidity, on the expectations that were ever present, like an invisible weight on his shoulders. The lessons were clear, almost inflexible. "You will carry our family name with pride," his father would say, always with a serious expression. But deep, he believed that his father's love depended on his ability to live up to those expectations. He believed that to be worthy of his father, he needed to be an extension of what his father represented: an empire, a line of succession, a history that should be passed on. The memories he had cultivated throughout his childhood now seemed distorted. He realized that, although his father had shown affection, this affection was always conditional on perfect performance. His father's love, ever present in his life, was intertwined with expectations. What would happen if he couldn't deliver? What would happen if his true identity strayed from the values his father so rigidly upheld? Those questions, once unconscious, now weighed on him like a giant stone. The protagonist felt a tight lump in his throat. He tried to recall moments of genuine affection, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it had all been a facade. His father's love seemed conditional. His father's acceptance hinged on his ability to be the perfect successor, to carry the weight of the lineage with courage and strength. But he could no longer ignore the fact that, beneath it all, lay a lack of freedom, a lack of space to be himself. What he had always thought was his father's love now seemed like a silent contract. "If you do everything I expect of you, I will love you. If not, you will no longer be my son." The memories were painful and, at the same time, revealing. He could no longer deny how much his father's expectations had shaped his life, and how trapped he had always felt in a destiny he hadn't chosen. He had always believed he should be the man his father wanted him to be, the man the family wanted to see at the helm of the business, the heir to the fortune. But now, as he reflected on all he had lost, he realized he had never been free to be who he truly was. He felt guilty for not having been able to live up to those expectations. Guilty for not having been the perfect son, the one who would follow in the line of succession and carry on the legacy. He wondered what would have happened if he had told the truth sooner. What would have happened if he had told his father who he really was, what he really felt. But there was no going back. The cut in the will, the exclusion from his life, had already happened, and he wondered if he could have prevented it all. If he would have done something differently to avoid losing everything, could it have been different? He wondered, the weight of guilt now becoming more palpable. Could I have still been accepted if I had been more like he wanted, more like the family expected? He closed his eyes, trying to concentrate, trying to push away the tormenting thoughts. He knew that if he continued this spiral of self-criticism, he would sink into an endless hole. But the pain was immense. He had lost his father's love, his place in the family's history, the future he had imagined he had. He had lost everything. Guilt and pain consumed him, but at the same time, he felt a growing anger. Anger at the fact that he never had the chance to be who he truly was, to be free to make his own choices without the fear of disappointing everyone around him. Anger at having been shaped by expectations that weren't his. Anger at having been forced to live a life that wasn't his. However, as time passed and he continued his reflections, something within him began to shift. His anger began to transform into a sense of liberation. He realized that, although he had lost what he thought was rightfully his, there was still something more important he needed to find: his true identity. He began to understand that, although the loss was painful, true liberation would come when he was able to reconnect with who he truly was, without fear, shame, and the need to please others. The guilt still haunted him, but he knew he needed to move on, start over, and learn to live with what was left. And as heavy as the weight of being rejected by his family and disinherited was, he now understood that true peace would come not from restoring what he had lost, but from embracing what he could be, without any more fear of loss. The bar's atmosphere was welcoming, but also immersed in a sense of disconnection. Soft lights illuminated the small establishment, and the sound of conversation and laughter filled the space in an almost comforting way. But for the protagonist, the bar seemed to be the exact reflection of what he felt inside, a mixture of distraction and an attempt to escape reality. He stood there, in a secluded corner, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotion. What troubled him most was uncertainty. After losing contact with his family, after his father's brutal rejection and the loss of what seemed to be his identity, he felt completely lost. He didn't know where to go or what to do. All his life, he had followed a path imposed by his father, a path of expectations, norms, and rules about what it meant to be successful. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. He was alone, without the material possessions he thought would define his worth, without the support of his family, and, most importantly, without knowing who he truly was. It was then that his friend appeared, as if he were the very relief he'd been searching for. Alex, his best friend since college, had always had the ability to see beyond superficial layers, to perceive what was truly happening to the people around him. And although the protagonist had avoided talking about the pain of being disinherited, Alex knew something was deeply wrong. The two had met in a simpler time, but now they were immersed in much more complex realities, which made that encounter crucial. "I knew something was going on, but I never imagined it was this serious," Alex said as he sat down next to the protagonist. "Tell me what's going on in your head." The protagonist, his eyes fixed on the glass, hesitated for a moment, unsure where to begin. "I don't know who I am anymore, Alex. What happened in my life? I lived my entire existence following my father's rules, hoping to be the family heir, hoping to be the man he always wanted me to be. And now, with everything that's happened, I'm asking myself, who am I? What's left of me?" Alex watched him carefully, his gaze deep, not judgmental, but filled with empathy. He knew his friend's words reflected the inner emotional turmoil he was experiencing. "You're trying to find your place, but at the same time, you're still stuck in what others expect of you," Alex replied, his voice calm and composed. "I think you've never given yourself the chance to be yourself." The words fell like a stone into a deep lake, sending ripples that spread through his mind. "To be myself," the protagonist murmured, pondering what that would mean. "But what if being myself is something my father would never accept? What if I can no longer be who he wanted, who I was trained to be?" Alex smiled softly, understanding his friend's inner struggle. "That's the point. You've spent your entire life fitting into a mold, trying to be what others want. But what if that's not the life you truly want to live? What if the key to your inner peace is embracing who you are, regardless of who it pleases or disappoints?" Alex's words resonated deeply. The protagonist looked at his friend, trying to grasp the meaning of what he was saying. "But living my truth means losing everything I've built. How can I simply give up everything my family has built?" Alex shook his head calmly, aware of the complexity of the situation. "I know what you're thinking. You think you've lost everything, and this feels like the end of a cycle, but in reality, it's just the beginning of a new one. When you live your truth, you gain something no one can take from you: inner peace. And that, my friend, is more valuable than any inheritance or empire you may have lost." The protagonist was quiet, reflecting. He thought about everything he had lost, the conversations he had with his father, the expectations projected onto him since childhood. The idea of abandon everything his family had built seemed daunting, but at the same time, something inside him began to make sense. He had been raised to be the successor, to carry the weight of the lineage, to always be what his father wanted. And no matter how hard he tried to fulfill the role he was given, he could no longer ignore the emptiness he felt in doing so. He had lost his identity, and perhaps that was what was truly at stake, his own identity. "So what do I do now?" he asked, his voice lower, as if he were asking for the key to a new life. Alex paused before answering, as if carefully considering the words he was about to say. "You start living for yourself instead of for others. It doesn't matter what your father or anyone else thinks. The only judgment that matters is your own. Living your truth can be difficult at first. It can be painful. It can require you to lose things. Yes, but true freedom comes when you allow yourself to be who you truly are without hiding. There is no greater peace than that." The protagonist felt, for the first time, as if a heavy curtain had been lifted. He looked at his friend, feeling the weight of his words. It was true. All his life, he had molded himself according to external expectations, but he had never stopped to think about what he truly wanted, what he truly needed to be happy. The conversation continued, but the protagonist was already in a state of deep reflection. He thought about what Alex had said, about the idea of leaving for oneself, of being authentic, even if it meant sacrificing something or someone, and he realized that true peace lay not in being accepted by others, but in being honest with oneself. "I'll try, Alex," the protagonist said, his voice firmer. "I'll try to be who I truly am, even if I have to fight against all expectations, even if I lose more things. I know it'll be hard, but it's the only path I can take now." Alex smiled with a satisfied look. "You've already taken the first step, my friend. And with that, you're closer to peace than ever." The protagonist felt at peace for the first time in a long time. He knew his journey was just beginning, and that it would be difficult. But now, he had a direction. Living his truth, though painful, was the only possible path to finding true freedom. He emerged from that conversation with a lighter weight on his heart, a weight he himself had carried for years. Now, he was ready to begin the journey back to himself. The golden glow of wealth could never hide the darkness lurking behind the mansion's velvet curtains. The grandeur of the walls, the glass windows that perfectly reflected the sunlight, the soft sound of the piano playing in the background at lavish social events. This was part of the facade the protagonist and his family presented to the world. But upon closer inspection, what lurked behind that sheen was something quite different. The life of wealth and power the protagonist had always known was not only a blessing, but a burden that weighed heavily on the shoulders of everyone in the family. The empire his father built was vast and imposing, but what seemed like the dream of anyone who desired power and influence for the protagonist became a gilded prison. His family's money and status had created a dividing line between him and others, an invisible wall separating people's true essence from what wealth had made them. He had always known somehow that the family's wealth was both a blessing and a curse. From childhood, he was taught never to let success make him forget humility. But it was impossible not to notice the growing distance between himself and others as the family fortune expanded. Every time his father made a point of flaunting his influence, every lavish event he organized to impress others, it became clear that people's worth was measured by what they had, not by who they were. But as he grew older, he increasingly realized how this obsession with status and power was corroding family relationships. The relationship between him and his parents was always marked by expectations of success, but also by a lack of true emotional connection. His father, an imposing man, never showed genuine affection. The love he always thought he received was contingent on performance, on the ability to carry on the legacy and keep the family name intact. What remained for the protagonist was a constant need to prove his worth. The downside of fortune became even clearer when he saw his own friends and family consumed by an obsession with power and wealth. They were all trapped in a cycle of competition, where those who had more, who dominated more, were more respected. Relationships were measured by material goods, possessions, and status, not by human qualities or emotions. At home, family conversations were never about feelings, personal achievements, or genuine aspirations. They were always about numbers, profits, business, and how to keep the empire running. The protagonist's mother, a sophisticated and charming woman, always had a pragmatic outlook on life. She loved the luxuries that wealth afforded, but her relationship with her husband and son was always marked by emotional distance. She seemed more concerned with the family's public image than with her own son's well-being. When he was a child, she was proud of his achievements in school or social activities, but she never seemed genuinely interested in what he felt or thought. What mattered to her was maintaining a facade of perfection, as if the world were constantly watching. For her, money was the pillar of family happiness and stability, and anything that might undermine that image was avoided at all costs. Over time, the protagonist began to understand that the family bonds he idealized as unbreakable were actually fragile, anchored in superficiality. The true connection he longed for never existed. Family members were more concerned with what they had to show than with what they were truly feeling. When he needed emotional support, when he wanted to vent about his fears and insecurities, what he received was silence or superficial advice. His father never told him he loved him, and his mother, although always polite and affectionate, was more interested in what he did than in who he truly was. Wealth and power had created a rift between people who should have been close. And the most ironic thing of all was that as the fortune grew, the family grew further apart. Family gatherings, instead of moments of togetherness, were merely occasions to flaunt their possessions and discuss business. Happiness was replaced by the relentless pursuit of more success and power. And in the end, the protagonist realized that despite having everything money could buy, he was, in fact, alone. It was one night, while walking alone through the mansion's gardens, that he had the epiphany that would change his life forever. He stopped and looked at the distant city lights, reflecting on the price he had paid for all the family's wealth. He remembered the empty conversations he had with his father, the moments of emotional absence from his mother, the constant pressure to fit into a mold that had never truly been his. He felt the absence of affection, the lack of a genuine connection with the people around him. Everything he had thought worthwhile, everything he thought would make him happy, now seemed futile. That night he understood that true wealth lay not in material possessions or the accumulation of power, but in authentic relationships, in the sincere human connections he had neglected for so long. The empire his family built had become a gilded prison. The love he thought he was receiving was actually an exchange, a bargain in which money and power were the true protagonists. And he, a mere pawn in this game, hadn't realized how much of himself he had lost along the way. The pain of realization was profound, but it was also liberating. He began to understand that the price of acceptance was higher than any material value he could achieve. To be accepted, he had sacrificed his own identity, his own feelings, his own needs. And now, finally realizing this, he knew he needed to change. He could no longer live in a world where people were measured by what they possessed, the power they wielded, or the image they projected. True change began within himself. He needed to leave behind the legacy of superficiality he had inherited and seek something deeper, something more real. The search for authenticity wouldn't be easy. He knew he would have to fight against all the pressure from his family, against expectations, against the idea that people's worth lies in the things they possess. But as he realized this, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He could rebuild his life, not based on wealth or power, but on authenticity, love, and genuine connection with others. The impact of wealth and power on his family life had been devastating, but the revelation of how far he had strayed from his true self was the first step toward finding something more valuable than any fortune: inner peace. The rented room was simple: white walls without paintings, antique furniture, and a small window that let in only a sliver of streetlight. For someone who had grown up in a mansion surrounded by luxury, the space might have felt suffocating. But for the protagonist, there was something different. There's something he hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. For the first time, there were no judgmental stares, no imposed expectations, no obligations tied to a heavy surname. He was alone, but free. Free from the burden of representing a legacy he never asked to carry. The first few nights were strange, accustomed to having everything at his disposal: servants, drivers. Butless, he now found himself preparing his own dinner, doing his own laundry, and taking care of daily tasks. Small actions that seemed insignificant to most people were almost revolutionary to him. There was something liberating about making his own coffee, putting the kettle on, and smelling the brewing aroma, without anyone doing it for him. It was as if each simple gesture was a silent declaration: I am capable. I don't need wealth to exist. By losing his inheritance, the protagonist believed he would also lose his identity. For weeks, he carried the weight of rejection within him, as if he had been torn from his very roots. But over Chimi, he realized that the fear imprisoning him came not only from the financial cut or the separation from his family, but from the idea of never having been accepted for who he truly was. Living behind masks had been his greatest prison, and now that all that had fallen away, he began to see his authenticity clearly. One day, walking through the square in the simple neighborhood where he now lived, he saw children running and laughing, unconcerned about tomorrow. He felt a pang in his heart, a mixture of childhood nostalgia and an unexpected revelation. When had he lost that purity? When had he let his laughter be stifled by the weight of expectations? Seeing those children, he understood that freedom lay in living in the present without the constant pressure to live up to something greater than himself. There, in that moment, he realized he no longer needed to fear who he was, nor hide his truth. It was during this process that he began to reconnect with his true self. He picked up the guitar he'd forgotten for years, the same instrument he'd loved to play as a teenager, but which his father considered a waste of time. The first notes were shaky, but soon the chords came to life, bringing with them memories of who he was before he lost himself in the weight of his legacy. Music became his escape, but also his mirror, reminding him that within him there was still a flame that had never been extinguished, only stifled by fear. And it was upon rediscovering music that the protagonist began to realize that his authenticity lay not in money, nor in his surname, nor in the empire he had lost. His authenticity lay in what had always brought him joy, in what reflected his truth, however simple. The fear that had once consumed him, fear of not being accepted, of being rejected, of being considered weak, was transformed into courage. Courage to embrace who he was. Courage to say, I exist, even if you don't accept me. Little by little, he realized that the absence of his inheritance wasn't a void, but an opportunity. He could rebuild his life from within, without having to conform to family standards. He discovered that the freedom to be who he truly was came at a high price. Yes, but no price was greater than living imprisoned within himself. The pain of rejection was still there, but now it was transforming into strength. He began to understand that he wasn't a victim, but a protagonist of his own story. Over time, his mind stopped revisiting his father's words so often. The "You're not my son anymore" that echoed in his memory now began to lose its power. Yes, those words hurt him, but they also freed him. They shattered the illusion that his life had to revolve around his father's approval. Finding himself outside that circle of control, he realized he could finally choose his own path. Fear, once paralytic, was now fuel. He knew the future wouldn't be easy without an inheritance, without the support network that had always protected him. But for the first time, he didn't fear failure. Because failure, he discovered, wasn't about losing money or status, but about losing himself, and that he was no longer willing to allow. The protagonist now walked new, uncertain roads, but with a lightness he had never experienced before. He no longer needed the masks he had worn for years to please his father or society. He no longer needed to pretend to be someone he was not. The freedom to be authentic, even if it cost him dearly, was the greatest inheritance he could acquire. And so, in silence, inside that simple room, he smiled for the first time without fear. A smile that didn't need to prove anything to anyone, just reflecting the peace of someone who was finally at peace with himself. The weight that once seemed insurmountable was now just a distant memory. When the protagonist looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the reflection of someone lost in a sea of expectations and pressures. Finding himself free from the burden of inheritance, free from the shadow of the family legacy that suffocated him, he could finally breathe. The pain of rejection was still present, but it was no longer the center of his existence. He had freed himself, and with this freedom, what appeared before him was not a void, but an immense opportunity, the chance to start over, to reinvent himself, and to live for himself without any more masks. He wasn't sure where to begin. The world outside the bubble of wealth and power he'd always lived in was vast and uncertain. What he did know, however, was that the first step was to move away from what limited him, from what made him look back with pain and regret. He decided he would no longer look back, that he would not allow memories of his father, family expectations, or the loss of everything he knew to define his future. The new beginning began with small things. He began to care for himself in a way he never had before. He took long walks around the city, exploring new places and observing people. He felt he was rediscovering the simple pleasure of existing, something that had been stifled throughout his life under the weight of success and power. By beginning to focus on the present, rather than being consumed by what he lost, he realized that true future building lay not in a new empire or riches, but in reconnecting with himself. His inner journey led him to distance himself even further from the environment that had shaped him. He knew that while the pain of being disinherited had been devastating, it had also been necessary. It was the loss that led him to realize that his true identity lay not in the possessions he owned, the expectations others had of him, or the family name. His true identity lay within himself, and that could not be taken away by anyone. In the early days after deciding to start over, he spent a lot of time alone, but never lost. He began exploring new interests, things he'd always wanted to do but never had the courage to. He began writing, something he'd always wanted to do but had been suppressed by commitments and responsibilities. Writing became a form of expression, a way to organize his thoughts and feelings. The words flowed like a river that had finally found its way, unhindered. He also dedicated himself to new projects, ones that were valuable to him, not to the image of success his family always tried to mold him into. He got involved with causes that touched him, helping others who, like him, needed support to get back on their feet. Through these new projects, he began to build something that was his own. It wasn't a fortune, nor a family legacy, but something much deeper. A positive impact on people's lives, a way to give back to the world what he had learned throughout his journey. At the same time, he began to open himself up to new relationships. The loneliness that had enveloped him for so long was now seen with new eyes. He understood that true relationships don't depend on titles or status, but on genuine connection and empathy. Little by little, he made new friends, people who saw him for who he truly was, not the name he carried. These new friendships made him understand that true wealth lay in the exchange of experiences and mutual support, not in a bank account full of zeros, but the greatest transformation was internal. By moving away from the shadows of the past and taking control of his life, the protagonist reconnected with his deepest values. He discovered that He no longer needed external validation to feel important. His inner peace came from living according to his own convictions and being true to his truth without worrying about the opinions of others. With each step he took toward a new path, each new project, and each new relationship he cultivated, he felt stronger, more confident, and freer. The fear that had previously paralyzed him, the fear of not being accepted, of losing what he already had, of failing, began to dissipate. He learned that true failure lay not in losing his fortune or his family's approval, but in not being true to himself, in living a life that wasn't his own. The new beginning wasn't easy, and he knew there would still be difficult days ahead. But for the first time, he felt he was on the right path, a path he was choosing with his own hands. He understood that in losing everything he thought was his, he had found something far more valuable, the freedom to be who he truly was. Over time, the weight of rejection became just a scar, a mark of his journey, no longer an open wound. He had healed from the inside out and was now a completely new person. He no longer needed the empire his family had built. He no longer needed the legacy to feel important. He had found his own worth, his own reason to keep going. Are you ready for more? The protagonist's fresh start is just the beginning of an even more impactful journey. Don't miss the next story, where the unexpected will happen and even more profound changes will emerge. Hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for the next exciting narrative. Share this video with someone who needs a fresh start and comment below. What would be your first step towards starting a new life?